Welcome everyone to episode 11 of the Science and Healthcare Sustainability Podcast. Before we start, I just want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, Lampadina Group, and flying the flag today. So thank you for providing the equipment and the time and the staff as usual. No pastries this week because our guest is over in the United States. But yeah, welcome to the podcast, Greg, and Alex, over to you for Greg's first question.
Hi Greg, thanks for being on. First question, always the same one. What is sustainability to you?
Well, first, thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. I like what you've been doing, and I think it's important to have these discussions. So most of what I do is informed by the fact that I'm a parent. So I'm always thinking about my kids and what we're going to leave for them. So to me, sustainability is a core part of every decision going forward, whether it's something that we're doing here in our industry or even if we're at home. So I think I can remember a time when I was young and we didn't have the ability to recycle, and then that became a common thing. And my kids don't know anything different, right? So for them, they've sort of been brought up with that mindset that if you can do something that's more sustainable, you should. And to me, that's what sustainability is. It becomes this core component, almost on a checklist when you're either making a decision or you're going to develop a product, or even if you're deciding where to go on vacation. This responsibility that we all have to do things more sustainably and to more positively impact the environment. It's a great responsibility. If we want to do things like, the race to zero, and we want to minimize the effect of climate change, sustainable decisions have to be paramount and inform everything we do, whether it's in business or in our personal lives.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, actually. You would think with sustainability and recycling being such a big thing now and a done thing, that the next generation, it should just be a natural do it. There shouldn't be as much need to impress it upon people.
Yeah,
they know it from an early age.
Yeah, and I think even in the conversations I've had, I've been doing this for just over 20 years at this point, and from when I started to now, you can see a change. So when I started, there were researchers who had been there for decades. They were quite entrenched in what they were doing, and then over time, as those people and individuals you mentioned, as they came up through college and graduate school, and they were postdocs, you would see that the way that sustainability and recycling was sort of part of what they did, it would kind of bubble to the surface. And it was really interesting, the time from when I started to now, to actually see that conversation develop, almost as if that younger generation was saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of things that we're doing here that could be, more sustainable, or, we could use less energy, or why do we do this way? Can we make changes here and there to have a better impact on our environment and minimize, the impact of our research.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And it's encouraging to hear that you're seeing that mindset change. I've not been in business as long as you, the industry should say, but even over my sort of 15, 16 years, I've seen that change, definitely. And, Lampadina Scientific, one of the companies that we run, wouldn't have much of a product range 15 years ago. There wasn't that choice to give scientists, and I think it's a two-way street. There's demand from the scientists, but there's also pushback from the manufacturers in terms of their R&D to bring out products, and we'll go on to some of yours later, which I think are fantastic. Just sort of zooming on the US for a second, what do you think the scale of the problem is in the laboratories in the US? What would you say we're tackling here?
Well, even from the time we started talking to now, it's grown, right? So the rate of research is something that is not, it's always changing and it's growing. So biotech, pharmaceutical research, every year becomes a larger industry. And that means that the impact it's having, unless some real changes are made isn't going down. So for things like our product line that we'll talk about, as that amount of research increases, the need for things like single-use plastics goes up. That's not going down. So we know the general rule of thumb that most people reference is, an older number that is at this point north of 6 million metric tons of single-use plastic being disposed of every single year. And that's an old number. Again, the industry is growing exponentially, and when that happens, those plastics and their impact also go up exponentially. So it's a very relevant topic. It is a very important need for us as suppliers and manufacturers and an industry to address. So, and here in the United States, with the level of research that's being done, certainly it should be a priority.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great point. We had some news this week in the UK that the government's going to put 86 billion into the biotech research industry, which is fantastic news for employment and for research and for healthcare as well. There's going to be some fantastic findings come out of that money. There's also potentially £86 billion worth of rubbish and plastics going in the bin because of all the research that has to be done. So a bit of a double-edged sword, and I think you're right. I think it's the responsibility of the manufacturers to find solutions for scientists to do that sustainably. And as I said, you've got some great products that we'll get onto very shortly.
How do you think the US compares to the rest of the world with their appetite to sustainability, recycling, etc.? I won't mention Donald Trump and all of the news that you hear come out of the United States about how he doesn't care, but on the ground there, in your experience, how do you think the US compares?
Right. So I was privileged to spend some time over in Germany in the fall for a sustainable materials conference. And, with some of the contact we have with distributors and other partners in Europe and in the UK, I always got the sense that they were ahead of the curve in terms of sustainability and tackling those topics. And certainly from the minute I arrived in Germany until I left, it became quite apparent that there is a much more there's a greater focus on it. And just as we said before, where the concept of sustainability needs to be part of every decision you make, from the hotel to the conference to even some of the components of the city, it was clear that there was a more green mindset. So I would say that in terms of where things are, Europe seems to be ahead of the curve, but here in the States, there's been a massive movement to raise awareness and really sort of right the ship in terms of where the industry is going in addressing these very important issues. So what's nice is everyone I've found in this area is sort of working together. It seems like there's less competition and more of a team effort. And I think being able to approach it that way, we can look at some of the things that have been implemented in Europe. We can look at some of the focuses. I know that Ireland is doing a lot, and recently, I'm not exactly sure what the point was, but I feel like it was every lab is either required to be Green Lab certified or all their labs were Green Lab certified at that point. That's an amazing thing. And I think that, something like that, why wouldn't that be a requirement? So I think, the movement here is massive. And I think most companies and research institutions are moving in that direction. And it's great to have, examples from Europe to be able to, give us some ideas on where we can go from here.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and something I hadn't really considered before, about this sort of common cause that people, I feel like they're pulling together. There is businesses in competition for revenue, but actually there's a commonality between them, and does seem to be this open sort of dialogue between manufacturers, between customers as well, sharing their best practice. And I think people like My Green Lab, and over here we have something called LEAF as well from University College London, spreading those messages really helps. So Yeah, excellent point. Speaking of, trying to help address the impact, what is it that you do and where do you do it?
So I'm the Vice President of Business and Product Development for Diversified Biotech. Most people in the industry would know Diversified as the CryoTag, CryoBaby, and ToughTag people. So we've been around for over 40 years. Those cryogenic labels and temperature-resistant labels were an innovation in the early 80s. So that's where our business started. And then from there, we expanded into unique and novel products that were developed by researchers and scientists to make the daily business of research easier. So things like pipetting aids and things like little racks that make it easier and more efficient to wash your slide cover slips. So I've been with the company for a little over 20 years. I had a few different roles, but again, most recently I've been working in product development. And we're based just outside of Boston and Dedham. This is our only location, but we have worldwide distribution. And that's the main company. That's the core company. But recently we've been focused on Planet Safe, which is our sustainable line of labware.
Tell us a little bit about Planet Safe and how this improves carbon footprint for your customers.
Yep. So in 2017, when we were trying to take the temperature of the market and see where it would make sense for us to focus our development efforts, there was a lot of buzz. That's when it really started to kind of surface about sustainability, and you started to see some very basic products that were made out of plant-based items. These sort of low risk, but low risk products in terms of something a researcher could use that wouldn't necessarily impact their research in terms of their results. So things like scoops and containers and things like that. So we decided to move into that area, and the first thing we did was make some PLA lab scoops. So these are single-use scoops that are plant-based that a researcher could use, throw away, and that would be better than throwing away a petrochemical-based scoop. And around that time, My Green Labs was headed by Alice in Paradise. So I had a call with her, and I said, we'd really like to move into this area because we feel there's a need there. So what sorts of things would be, what sort of products would be a good place for us to start? And we had discussed Petri dishes at the time. So we started to develop around that and learned very quickly that making PLA, or polylactic acid, resin into something that's clear and temperature resistant is quite difficult. So along the way, we developed a manufacturing method coupled with an irradiation method that produces a product that's more than just a Petri dish. Well, at the time, before we moved into other products, it was just a Petri dish. So we determined that the way that we were manufacturing and irradiating the product made it an excellent surface for adherent cell growth. So from there, we were able to patent that concept, which allowed us to focus on the cell culture area, which from a sustainable product perspective is good because when you're trying to move into a commodity like a Petri dish and you're trying to compete with a polystyrene Petri dish, it's almost impossible. At this point, the material on the product doesn't even really factor in terms of cost. So, it's difficult to get someone to pay more for anything that costs a nickel or 10 cents or something like that. So, I guess I should circle back and say for people who don't know what PLA and polylactic acid is and what's sort of unique about what we've done. So when we started to focus on Planet Safe, with all of the discussion about sustainability and greenwashing and being transparent, we decided that we wanted to ensure that Planet Safe would be that brand that customers could count on to be, a core number of things: plant-based, sustainable, equitable, and a one-to-one replacement for what they're using. So something that was, reproducible in terms of research. So there's a lot of different ways to make PLA. There's different feedstocks like corn or sugar beets, but specifically sugarcane is something that is, in terms of efficiency, it can be up to 3% more efficient to produce PLA from sugarcane than it can the other feedstocks. And most of that feedstock grows in, for us, in Thailand. So geographically, that's an area of the world where the natural rain cycles will do most of the irrigation. So from that standpoint, it becomes a sustainable feedstock that, has even more sustainable components to it. So 80% of the irrigation comes from rain cycles, 20% from, man-made irrigation systems. So that right out of the gate reduces, the required carbon footprint to keep those crops growing. So in terms of feedstock, we wanted to stick with what was the most efficient and the most environmentally friendly. We work with one specific partner, Total Energies Corbion, and what's unique about them is the plantations that grow their sugarcane and the facilities that then produce the PLA resin are all certified as equitable environments. So they get audited yearly to ensure that the safety conditions for the workers, first of all, that it is safe, and that their incidents are, they're not going up. So there's no issues with safety on either the plantation or at the conversion facility. And they're also ensuring that those workers are being compensated appropriately. So I always liken it to a fair trade coffee scenario, where they're ensuring that those workers doing this difficult work are being taken care of. So we really wanted to sort of ingrain that in what Planet Safe would be: a sustainable plant-based product that is coming from an equitable source that can be relied on to be, a transparent product. In the last, I'd say 12 months, something that was interesting that we're already at this point, but customers are already looking down the supply chain and saying, okay, I understand that your product uses recycled material or your product is plant-based, but where does that material come from? Where do those plants come from? And the importance of life cycle the LCA, the life cycle analysis, has gone up. So going forward, it's important that manufacturers are able to demonstrate and articulate to customers on a granular level where their inputs are coming from. So it's not just, enough now to say, well, it's recycled content, it's this, it's that. You have to be able to show that. And as Planet Safe has grown into, a cell culture microplate line, cell culture dishes, flasks will be coming. We wanted to make sure that every step of the way that we were, continuing to provide that transparency.
Yeah, fantastic. All that is very admirable, but I imagine that will all come at a cost. You can't do it so as well as you're doing it without incurring costs along the way. Has that been the biggest challenge with the product range, the actual comparative cost to, virgin polypropylene or polystyrene product, and is that sort of impeded the growth? Would you say the cost implications?
So that's certainly a consideration. One of the things, but we knew that going into it, being around, with the labels being around tubes and different products like that, we were aware of that concern. So we've created a structure where we want to be able to offer, say, a 96 well microplate that is, meant for cell culture, so a TC treated plate. We want to be comparable to that on a retail level. So when we go to market with these products, we want customers to look and say, okay, well, maybe it's, a little bit more, maybe it's 2% more, 3% more, but the benefits outweigh that increase. So in those situations where, and I think we're finally starting to get to a point where it's changed a little bit, but where customers would say, oh, well, if it's plant-based or if it's environmentally friendly, it's going to be twice as much. It's going to be way more expensive. I'm never going to be able to fit that in our budget. But focusing on the actual outcome of what we're trying to do, we work very hard to ensure that those products are comparable or in some cases even competitive with what's already on the market. So that's certainly part of the challenge. The more difficult part of the challenge in introducing Planet Safe is the fact that, researchers, I always say that they're at the front of the line when it comes to sustainability, but they're sort of at the back of the line when it comes to flexibility. And the reason for that is research is important and it's expensive. So while they might not like the idea of single-use plastics, it's impossible to argue with the fact that they know what they're getting when they purchase a microplate or a cell culture dish. They know that it's reproducible. They know that it's sterile. They know that it's been tested to ensure that it's pyrogen free, DNAs, RNAs free. So it's, as much as they might want to make that change, it's difficult. So the challenge for us is engaging with researchers and helping them get comfortable with the fact that we have a plant-based product that will perform in the same manner as their current petroleum-based product. So that conversation becomes almost it's almost like getting cross-examined. When you start that conversation and they'll say, well, what about this? And well, here's the answer to that. It's plant-based, but I use these solvents. Okay, well, there's here the solvent resistance. I grow cells if it's not coated. How do I know that my cells are going to adhere? Well, here are the cells that we've tested. So to address this, we've signed a contract and we're working with INSERM, which is NIH in France, to perform comprehensive studies on anything you can name: fluorescence, luminescence, adherent cell growth, anything. That's where we'll start, and they'll test different scenarios for us, focused around cell culture, which is where right now where we're focused. So that conversation of trying to help the researcher understand that something that's plant-based can sort of even survive in the laboratory environment has been the biggest challenge. However, researchers that are open to trying the product usually don't have any issues. When I say usually, we've come across customers who would say, well, I'd like to try your product, but I do this longer term incubation on my cells. Is there an issue there? And we can say, well, we're not sure, but we'll work with you to determine that. And this is actually a real world example that happened to us. So we worked with the company to provide samples to allow them to test Planet Safe in their situation under the specific circumstances. And I'm happy to say that once that those studies were done and those tests were passed, they actually switched over to Planet Safe for their highest volume single-use product. So in terms of challenges, strangely enough, the cost was the easy one. It's getting researchers to make that change that's been more difficult.
Yeah, excellent point. I mean, when we have conversations with scientists, often we start with what we call easy wins, which is, example behind us, the bio bins. It doesn't touch the science, as we say, so why wouldn't it be made of cardboard? What's the point of making that out of plastic? It's going to be burnt anyway. And hopefully we get to a point where, with your products, where scientists have the same perception of, well, why wouldn't that be plant-based? Because it works perfectly well, and X, Y, and Z labs are already using it, so I've got confidence that it'll work for my cells as well. So great to hear that you're investing heavily in testing, and the more people that embrace it, the more reference sites you'll have to point at to say, well, everyone else is doing it, so should you. So yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, and even touching on the collaborative part of what we're doing, PLA is something that's recyclable. PLA is something that is reusable, right? So when you've got these other companies out there that have innovated around, well, how can we take these single-use plastics and dispose of them or reuse of them? How can we do that? So you've got companies like Granova, where their customers are washing and reusing some consumables. You've got polycarbon, which we mentioned before. If something like Planet Safe was to reach enough of a volume, well, we could have that conversation with polycarbon. Could you put a separate receptacle in a laboratory, and then those customers that are using plant-based products or using Planet Safe can put them in there, and then you can recycle them. We know that our products work with Granova. So if there's a customer out there that says, well, I'd like to switch, but I don't necessarily know that I need to, because my consumables I put them in my Granova machine and then I reuse them 2, 3, 4 times, whatever it may be. Well, we know in working with Granova that our products will work in their with their equipment. So it's less about competition, more about addressing that sustainability need, right? So if someone was to use a Planet Safe item in the Granova system, once the Planet Safe item has made it to the lab, they've sort of already won, right? Because no fossil fuels were required. From a material production standpoint, it's an 83% lower carbon footprint to make PLA than it is something like polystyrene. And then if they're going to reuse it, that's fine with us. Reuse it. Put it in the Granova machine. Reuse it however many times you normally would. The goal is to address those issues that are affecting climate change. And we feel we can have a place there, and we don't need to even try to push other companies that have other approaches out of the way.
Yeah, excellent.
So aside from your products and thinking more about you guys as a business, what's the most wasteful thing that you do, and what sort of steps have you put in place to mitigate that?
So from a corporate perspective, I would say that the most wasteful thing we do here in Dedham is just the way that we operate the office. So we've done so much focus on developing Planet Safe that it was almost like an epiphany moment where we stopped and said, wait a minute, okay, so when we moved into this facility, we put in motion sensing lights, and everything's LED. We have the HVAC system is being managed very efficiently, but we still have those silly things that offices have, like paper coffee cups and things of that nature. So from a corporate perspective, we've started to look at what we're doing here and make those changes that would be expected of a company offering a sustainable product. And for years, when we would receive materials in, we would take that dunnage and set it aside. Well, even if that dunnage was bubble wrap, let's say, we would reuse that. Well, that's good, but no one wants to see bubble wrap anymore. So one of the things we'll be doing is looking at from a shipping perspective, what materials we're using and where they're coming from, and how we can improve there. From a manufacturing standpoint for Planet Safe, it's really all about transportation. In a perfect world, we could grow sugarcane wherever we want, but that's not the case. So it's always going to be coming from Thailand. Right now, we're manufacturing Planet Safe on the West Coast, and we're on the East Coast. So until Planet Safe, has more of a following, that transportation factor is always going to be an issue. We're lucky that when we're manufacturing the actual product, we already have steps in place. So we're using hydroelectric generated power. We're using electric injection molded machines. It's at a facility where there's closed loop cooling systems for water, so the need for water usage is much lower. I think there'll always be something. There'll always be a hot spot to address. And right now, from those two different points of view, I'd say that's where they are. So transportation in the future, that's something that we can address as there's greater volumes of Planet Safe being sold. But we know that will come up sooner rather than later for us to take a look at.
I think it's important to practice what you preach. We do a similar thing here. We're 90% renewable energy. We've got solar panels on the roof. We charge our cars using the solar panels. We go visit our customers in those cars that have been charged up by the solar panels, and we're quite proud of that. I think it's important to be seen to be doing your bit as well as encouraging your customers to do the same.
Absolutely.
So obviously you've been doing it for a little over 20 years. What would you tell yourself just starting out that you know now? What's the biggest lessons that you've learned that would sort of help you fast track the success you've had?
Well, I don't know about fast track, but I would go back and I would tell myself, certainly in developing Planet Safe, to be patient, right? So most of the impactful information and data points that we have from Planet Safe are from say me going out and taking the product and saying, look at this is plant-based, isn't it terrific? Well, what about X, Y, and Z? That's a good question. I'll find that out. And each of those different challenges they've been great learning experiences, and they've been invaluable in terms of making the product what we really want it to be and what it is. But that there's a level of frustration that comes along the way, right? So understanding that you can't just show something to a researcher and have them jump on board, but that they're going to have different concerns and different questions, and that's going to require different data points and different answers. So when we first introduced Planet Safe, and we said it's compostable, so all Planet Safe products will always be 100% industrially compostable, period, full stop. Well, that's terrific, except researchers don't have an outlet to compost those products. And as a matter of fact, in the United States, they can't. I've tried 3 or 4 different agencies to certify, to put their stamp on it, so that when the industrial composting sites here in the States get the product, they look at it and say, oh, it's this certified or it's that certified. So I know it's okay for me to put in my compost pile. So right now, there's really no easy way to do that. So that messaging on the compostability, well, then it changes, right? Because no one's composting it. Most of our customers are incinerating it because it's biohazardous waste. Okay, so it's a much better story to tell. When you incinerate polystyrene, there's issues there, and it's a carbon positive process, right? So you're actually adding carbon to the air, but when you are incinerating our products, it's a carbon neutral process. You're just releasing the biogenic carbon that was already contained within the product. So when people say things like, well, I can't compost it, so how do I get rid of it? Don't change anything you're doing. Take the product, do your research, put it in the incinerator. And there's benefits to doing that, right? That's where the lower carbon footprint of the PLA comes from. Because it's coming from sugarcane, that biogenic carbon that's held within the product is what gets released when it's incinerated. So I would go back and I would tell myself to be patient, and that whatever the level of questions I thought I was going to have from customers, it was exponentially higher than that, as it should be.
Interesting. Yeah.
Do you think labs can ever do away with using plastic? Do you think they can ever get to complete carbon neutrality?
Yeah, the optimist in me says yes, right? I think we're all hopeful in that way, but in being realistic, I think we'll never get to be completely carbon neutral in that regard. There's always going to be something, right? I think that and I've seen facilities here in Boston. There's a great facility that MIT built called the Engine, and it's a LEED certified building where different companies can come in and essentially rent lab space, and they've got everything, right? They have an HVAC system that has biometric sensors so that when the last person has left the building, within some amount of time, the HVAC system shuts down until the next morning to really minimize that energy usage. So I think that we can make tremendous steps forward and get close. And if I was a betting person, I would say that there's likely a level where we can all get where that will essentially be the acceptable level of zero, because there's always going to be something along the way that will add to that. So the optimist says we can get really close, and I've seen again some examples and of that actually happening. So
yeah,
I think
something you said earlier, Greg, really. I mean, I've always said no to that question. I've always said no, I don't think it's possible, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But something you said earlier, it really kind of inspired me to think it's possible, because it's almost like sustainability turbocharged. You said you can go plant-based, then reuse, and then when it comes to the end of its usable life, you can then recycle that material as well. It's something I hadn't considered. We work with a company in the UK called Recycle Lab, who are recycling lab plastics. The fact that they can potentially recycle plant-based plastics as well is kind of game changer for me. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we can envision a scenario where someone is buying Planet Safe and they're reusing it, and then they're sending it to be recycled. What's really interesting about PLA as a material is it can be chemically recycled. So products like Planet Safe can be broken down into their base components and built back up again into PLA and turned into resin. So when you're recycling things like other resins, mechanically over time, the more they get recycled, the less mechanically sound they are. But PLA is interesting in that regard, where you can almost perpetually and continuously chemically recycle it, and it doesn't lose any of its characteristics. So there is a scenario where again, we're getting really close, right? Where it's a plant-based product that's being reused, that is then being chemically recycled. So there's that circular economy of the consumable that could exist, and a scenario like that brings it again really close. So maybe that number isn't zero, but maybe it's low enough where we can say this is as close to zero as we're going to get.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So aside from Planet Safe, obviously you've had a lot of conversations with researchers over the years. Is there any other products you've seen people use or promoting that you think you'd recommend to our listeners?
Well, I think right now, because the single-use plastics obviously are still a core component to research, there's a lot of companies addressing how to better manage that. And I mentioned Granova. Granova is a great company. They're going to allow you to reuse some of your single-use consumables. Polycarbon is doing a really great job. I know they're going to be expanding to Europe. So I don't see why every lab doesn't consider polycarbon from that regard. There's another company, Ion Field Systems. They're doing something similar to Granova, but in a different way. They actually have equipment that will allow you to plasma wash your labware. So that's interesting from our perspective, having a product that doesn't need to be coated for adherent cell growth. And a lot of times products are plasma coated. So we've done some work with them where we've put our products through multiple wash cycles to see what happens, because it's entirely possible that the surface effects of Planet Safe will go up in terms of the adherent properties. So there's a lot of companies out there that are doing those sorts of things, and I would say that if a lab was in a position where they might not be ready to do something like consider Planet Safe, that these are certainly fantastic companies to consider in the interim.
Brilliant. Thank you.
And do you consider sustainability worth paying premium for, or should we all be aiming for cost savings, parity on cost? Is that the ultimate aim, or do you think we should be encouraging people to spend a little bit more to save the planet?
So I think cost is always a consideration, and it's never going to go away. That said, I think we're in a position where it's almost a no-brainer to pay more for a sustainable product, given the circumstances we find ourselves in. We know that the impact we're having now isn't enough to keep that global temperature from rising above the break-even point where we're aiming for 2030. So I think that when you consider the costs of not using something when there's a sustainable alternative, I think it's worth paying more. Again, cost is always a consideration, right? So that's something that we've really tried to focus on to make it an easier change for researchers. So maybe they're paying a little more, but those days of paying twice as much or 50% more, given where we are, that's in the past. So I absolutely think that even if you're paying more for a sustainable product, when you look at the costs associated with and the environmental costs, especially with not paying a little extra, those costs on the environment far outweigh any increase to a product cost you might be paying. Just from this, the company I mentioned earlier, where we went in and we sort of worked with them to develop a study so that they could be comfortable using the product. That's one product. That's their in cell culture, that's their highest volume single-use item. And just by switching to Planet Safe, they're going to, and I wanted to make sure I got the numbers right. So in a year, that is 1,600 kilograms of plastic that they're going to offset. From an environmental perspective, taking it from production of the material all the way through research and then incineration, they're going to be not producing 10,000 kilograms of greenhouse gases. And that's also from a manufacturing perspective, that's 2,100 kilograms of petroleum that's not being required. So that process of, drawing the fossil fuels and then converting it into, something that's going to be used in the material, that doesn't happen. So, to the environment, what's that cost, right? There's heavy costs there. And if you were to pay 5-10% more in some cases for more sustainable product, it seems like it's well worth it, because we're at a point now where, again, that sustainability and that sustainable mindset needs to be something that informs us on every decision that we make. So I absolutely think that a sustainable alternative for something should be considered, and that more flexibility on the cost should be something that's, that folks are doing.
I think it's a great point, and great example as well of how it can be. The cost isn't the only consideration. Cost is always a consideration, unfortunately, but what we find as well is there's an inflexibility in sometimes the budget as well, in terms of particularly academic labs where they have a set amount of money for equipment, a set amount of money for consumables, and they can't deviate from that. So what we've been trying to do is kind of work in the cost of being sustainable to what they're already spending. If they're going to buy an incubator, for example, we'll give them some recycling bags to go for the consumers as well, and help them with that inflexibility. But I think it does need to come back to, and some UK funding bodies are waking up to this, it does come back to the fact that there maybe needs to be an allocation of budget for being sustainable. Maybe when the likes of CRUK are taking it very seriously, give out their grants, maybe they give a 10% boost for sustainability, or penalise labs who don't do that. So yeah, I think it's a whole mindset change as opposed to just is that more expensive or not. It's a huge amount more to consider. So you told us a lot about your business, you told us a lot about the product range you have at the moment, and you sort of alluded to the fact that there's going to be some tissue culture plastics coming soon. Is there anything else you can tell us that's coming out in the near future?
Yeah, so just to kind of plant the flag of where we are now. So so we have 100 millimeter, 150 millimeter cell culture dishes that are available. Microplates, we have 96 well round and flat bottom in bulk, 96 round and flat bottom individually wrapped with lids, and then 6, 12, 24, 48 will be in the near future. So I would consider those in the pipeline in, say, the manufacturing phase. Beyond that, we are developing cell culture flasks. That will likely be the next product in the pipeline that is available. Following after that will be roller bottles, and then we've been doing some development on serological pipettes, because what's great about the companies that hear about Planet Safe and they invite you in and you start to discuss the product and put together those studies so that they can get comfortable with it. That pops up a lot where they say, what about serological pipettes, right? They go hand in hand. When you're doing cell culture on a certain level, you're using those serological pipettes. So we want to make sure that we when we hear customers say things like that, we want to make sure that we're going to be able to make those sustainable products available to them. So the development pipeline is full, and generally speaking, that's where we're going.
Brilliant. Yeah, that sounds very exciting. If you think about the case of serological pets, though, we've kind of gone backwards on those. We did have a sustainable serological pet, and it was made of glass. I appreciate we've gone probably the wrong way on those, but it's great to hear that we're going back around and we're going back to a potentially. Would that be reusable? Could you reuse the serological pet once you've made it a plant-based material?
I don't see why you couldn't. Depending on how you were to prepare it to be reused. What's great about a Granova machine is that their washing is done at room temperature, so there's no concerns there. If we were to consider something like a PCR application, even for our higher temperature resistant PLA that we have, even that's a little too high. So we are doing some development in that area as well, to increase the temperature resistance so that we can move into those areas. So I imagine, depending on how you were to prepare that serologic pipette to be reused, I don't see any reason why you couldn't.
Brilliant. Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. Just before we kind of finish up, is there anybody else that you can think of or recommend for us to invite on our podcast?
Absolutely. I think someone who would be really interesting to speak to is Anthony Machete. He's the Director of Sustainability for Cell Signaling Technologies. And they're doing some really, really interesting stuff, ground up stuff. So they're here in Massachusetts, and they're in the process of building a new facility. And that's their focus, right? Sustainability, their impact on the environment, and how this new facility will slot into that. So yeah, nice guy, really interesting.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and talk about your amazing product range. We're looking forward to seeing it in Europe and hopefully the UK. And yeah, we'd love to have you back on in the future when you've got some more products to tell our listeners about.
Yeah, and hopefully everybody's still watching up to this point. But if you could like, subscribe, and hit that little bell icon so you don't miss out on any new updates. 11 podcasts so far.
11 yeah.
Brilliant. 11 of May.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for your time.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks.
Appreciate it as well.
Science and healthcare.